One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
Welcome to One Step Ahead Radio. This week we have a special guest and we're very happy to host you here, Ioannis. James and I will be hosting this session with you to tell audience and the world a bit about what is really going on in the space of ESG sustainability, and if there is any hope for people that believe that this could be something that could change the course of human history or a future going forward. Yeah, so now with these very big expectations and words, Ioannis, welcome to One Step Ahead Radio.
Sasha, James, thank you so much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to our pretty sure exciting conversation today.
We assure both of us it will be. Ioannis, maybe for the audience, the people who do not know you, I mean, we know you, but I think many people do, but let us know a bit about your background, what you're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at the London Business School for about 16 years now. I'm in the strategy department, and essentially all the work I do, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's about teaching or it's about engaging with companies, it's all about understanding whether, how, and the extent to which companies integrate these broader environmental and social issues into the way they do business. And a particular interest that I have is, of course, the interaction between corporates and financial markets and the investor community more broadly, in terms of understanding how do companies communicate what they do and how is that perceived, evaluated, rewarded, or sometimes even punished by the markets. So that's the big picture overview, and I have looked at that from many angles over the years, and not only in terms of teaching and research, but also in terms of real world engagement with companies as well.
Ioannis, thank you very much. I mean, it's inevitable question to start with. Everybody's talking about a backlash on sustainability, ESG. My question to you is that how structural is this? Because beneath the sort of the headlines, there is a work that companies are doing. I mean, you just recently been to Southeast Asia, Singapore. And the thing is that you can actually see that many companies are still doing what they're supposed to do, trying to improve things. But how structural is the backlash?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Sasha. I don't think there's a sort of one answer to this, right? Because I think that, in the spirit of being more positive, let me just say that if ESG, sustainability, climate, global warming, you choose your term, if these issues did not upset business as usual, nobody would backlash against them. So the silver lining is that if exactly because there's backlash, it means that at least to some extent, they are working and they are upsetting existing vested, sometimes corrupt interests as they should. So as you know, there is this backlash on ESG and DEI, but let's not have a short memory, right? There was a backlash against global warming, for instance, when it first came about. There were systematic funded efforts to undermine climate science. That's not because climate science has something in the title, it's because it was upsetting certain interests. And so I think that to a large extent, that's what's happening. And that's why, many people say, oh, should we use the term ESG? And I often say, you know what? The label is almost irrelevant. If another relevant that was upsetting business as usual, it would still be attacked. No, there are other factors. Of course, is ESG perfect? No. Is the data perfect? No. Are there companies who lie about their ESG efforts? Sure, plenty of them. However, we need to be very clear. As I often say this definition, reality, the definition, and politics. Reality. Are environmental and social issues improving? Are you kidding me? They're only getting worse, right? So that's the reality. The titles. Are corporate strategies evolving? Of course. They started from CSR, corporate citizenship, ESG, and ultimately the politics, the ideology. ESG and DI caught up in the culture wars in the US, as so many other things, and captured in the culture war.
Politicize is a sort of a tool. So, but you also mentioned something. I mean, I saw one of your posts as well related to this political thing. ESG is not about politics; it's actually about reality. And what's your take on that? Because many people are wondering in Europe, how will this sort of a US dysfunction move over to Europe. And of course, in Japan, for me, many people are asking what's going to happen in Japan too, in Southeast Asia. What's your take on that?
Now, it depends on the time horizon, Sasha. I think it's, and I had some wonderful conversations. As you mentioned, I was in Southeast Asia. I was in Singapore and Malaysia this past week, getting a much more refreshing and pragmatic approach, right? You go to Singapore, they say, you know what? We don't have resources. Of course, we need to capture all the rainwater. Of course, we need to recycle. And, we don't have space. So, of course, we need to consider vertical farming and what we can do with it and so on and so forth. So, necessity, leads to innovation. And obviously, sustainable development is part of, it's an absolutely part of the equation. Now, what's going to happen is it depends on the day, right? So let's see what kind of craziness we wake up to every day, and every day is different one. But I think that, and I agree with many views that I've heard recently, that in the short run, it may appear as if the US is winning, right? And these are for short-term political reasons and propaganda reasons even. But it's obvious to me that if these policies translate into, for instance, a lot less funding for research, a lot less funding for technology and innovation, while at the same time, countries like China double down, and they have been doubling down.
Yes.
In the long run, China is going to be the big winner, and the US is going to be the big loser, whereas regions like the EU, it will be that the impact is going to be critically depend on the decisions that they're taking now. How do they integrate the Draghi report? To what extent they use omnibus to water down regulations? So does Europe need a structural adjustment? Absolutely. Is that structural adjustment inconsistent with green growth? Absolutely not. And then the rest of the regions of the world, I think that, and that was the refreshing part this week, is this more pragmatic approach, right? And ultimately, Sasha, you mentioned politics. What I'm going to say is that, we need to look at these issues beyond politics. And I'm not saying something new, but people don't realize that, look, any kind of solution to these complex challenges is going to have elements of both the left and the right.
And the right, yes.
Think about carbon markets. Are they a market solution? Yes, that's a right-wing policy. Do we need regulation? Of course. How are you going to create a market without regulation with carbon credits that are actually valid? Is that a left or a right? It's neither one. It's as a forward, And I think a lot of these complex challenges need these nuanced, beyond politics solutions that will calm minds. We need to actually sit down and discuss. That's the kind of discussion, by the way, that sadly, tragically, I don't think is going to happen in the US, at least not during the Trump administration.
Most likely it will not happen during the next 4 years. James, you work with a lot of companies. From your angle, what Ioannis is saying about being pragmatic, what is your sort of a take to Ioannis about what you see?
Yeah, no, actually, I wanted to carry on just digging a bit more into what you were just saying there a bit about the various regional approaches, because what I'm kind of struggling with, and I think a lot of people are struggling with, is there was a kind of a drive towards a globalized agenda around sustainability in the last few years. And I think a lot of companies, work across so many different jurisdictions that it's advantageous for them, and it's clear for them when there's some kind of coherence around where we're going. And obviously global capital is global by definition, right? But what we're seeing now is more kind of a regionalization of approaches, but regulation and compliance efforts. And above all, here in Europe, it's been funny. In the last few weeks, I've been in a big WhatsApp group with tons of sustainability leaders and directors. They all seem to be asking the same set of questions around where do we go from here? How do we respond? Can we respond? In what form do we respond? To what extent do you think we're facing a period where we have to sort of define a regionalized approach to this? Because depending on your jurisdictions, you have such a different, an evolving situation politically and in terms of regulation. Or do you think there's some kind of new global sort of definition of what we can agree around sustainability going forward, to help companies guide their direction?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, James. I think that there's no doubt that we are going through a period of deglobalization. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, and I unfortunately, with the trade war, emerging trade war between U.S. and China, and U.S. and God knows who else, pretty much everyone, right? There is no question for me that we're going, rather than talking about multilateralism, we're going to go through fragmentation, more protectionist sort of measures, and therefore countries becoming indeed more regional. In other words, I wouldn't be surprised, and I've heard this in Southeast Asia that I just came from, that there's been a number of increase of bilateral yet local agreements.
Yes.
As opposed to this global. And Sasha, will be very interesting to see if that's reflected in what you're seeing as well. And therefore, when it comes to impact on sustainability, I think time will tell, right? It depends on to what extent this is a pragmatic approach. If, for instance, non-globalized supply chain could go both ways, right? It might force some countries, to become self-sufficient, but some of these countries might not have the resources, and therefore, almost by definition, they need to be innovative and use the resources that they do have and become sustainable. It's the whole idea of, think about Singapore's dependence on water from Malaysia, for instance, and how they need to do all of this purification, and sometimes they even sell water back to Malaysia because the water they have is so pure, for instance, right? Or they don't have space to do enough space for solar. What are they going to do next? So you think that sort of fragmentation and localization and isolationism may, if managed correctly through a policy framework, actually lead to more sustainable innovation, for instance, right? So there's nothing, in my view, deterministic about this. Everything will depend on the decisions that we take, and in fact, the political decisions that we take. Other things, like, think about China, for instance. I'm pretty sure they're thinking, oh, wow, this is an amazing opportunity. We can lead green tech. I mean, the US is taking climate data off the government website, right? Of course, if I were China, I would be doubling down on green tech right now, especially right now in some, like the energy sector, renewables are cheaper than oil and gas, right? Sasha, very interesting. Does that really?
Yeah, no, but okay, what you're saying is reflecting pretty much what I see in Japan, but also in a broader context. Because the people usually think about global consequences of climate change as a global phenomena. It's actually quite localized and regionalized. So what we as investors do nowadays, in much more deeper extent than before, is to ask companies, where is your production taking place? What's the location? Where are your supplies localized? We need trying to understand the physical but also transitional risk related to this. So I completely agree that in many ways sustainable transition going forward will be much more localized and regionalized, and there will be different solutions than the solutions that we will have in other parts of the world. Depending, of course, on politics, as you said. And I read something you wrote, and I found it so interesting. You quoted Churchill saying that we need more courage. The success and the failure they happen, but how do we master that courage right now? I guess, as James said in his WhatsApp group, people are quite desperate right now. And you mentioned that there are so many US people asking you if London Business School has a new position to open, So, yeah. It's almost like it's a wet blanket, but it's not only a wet one. It's a very sort of a fiery one right now. And we need to sort of calm down a bit, because I agree with you. This is not right or wrong, left or right. It is going to continue, but the pace might be different in the different parts of the world.
Yeah, how do we find the courage? You know what? I was going to say that for people like you, James, and myself that have been in this for a while, I mentioned before that I've been in this 16 years. Well, let's not forget, right? We started in the periphery. We started being considered niche. We started with many folks being dismissive, especially think about the world of business and business schools, right? The whole idea that, yeah, there were early pioneers, but it wasn't the mainstream. So it's not that we don't know, and you don't know, and what it means to have a backlash. It's not that we don't know what it means to have people sponsoring anti-climate science, even so-called scientists, to undermine the science.
Yeah.
This is not new, right? So perhaps one could take courage by the fact that not that it happened before, but that ultimately in the long run, we're not dealing with views or opinions or even negotiations here. There's we don't negotiate with Mother Nature when it comes to climate change. So courage, I think, in my humble opinion, it's about understanding that we are at this crossroads right now. People get sometimes confused, and even within the ESG sustainability space, and they think that, oh, we are abandoning the transition. That's not the right mind frame. What we need to understand here is that this transition is going to happen, period. Climate change is going to have an impact. Biodiversity loss is going to have an impact. Social inequalities are already having an impact. The only choice that we have, the courageous choice we need to make, is whether this transition is going to be orderly or disorderly, right? And what's happening right now, I think, without a doubt, in my view, is that we are on the disorderly transition path.
Yes. And that's one of the takeaways, actually, that we can, discuss a bit more, maybe, that this is disorderly transition. Yes, it's not really linear. It's going to be very bumpy and different in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, in the US, we are facing what we are facing. What is stunning to me is that how quickly the institutions in the US are giving in. You know, I really don't understand how the system works, because it's unbelievable that you have an administration that is basically under the sort of a freedom of speech, which is the constitutional right in the US, is forbidding use of certain terms. We are talking about the dictatorship, more or less. I mean, I don't know exactly what the implication of this will be for one of the biggest, they are, with China, the biggest economy in the world, and will, face and are facing tremendous consequences, financial consequences, in uninsured assets across the US because of the climate change. The question is, will US be left in 4 or 5 years' time compared to the European Union and Southeast Asia and some other parts of the world, because these other parts will adapt much faster? I don't know, but it's disorderly, and I completely understand. James, any views from your side on this?
Yeah, no, as I was listening to you speak, I'm thinking very much about how companies need to adapt to this kind of reality with very specific and very pragmatic and very results-based strategies, rather, because I've seen in the last few years when there was like this big boom of ESG, everyone wanted to sort of jump on the bandwagon. And I think it's been, it's counterproductive, because everyone was kind of trying to sing on the same from the same song sheet, and that this is going to bring a better future. And we had this wave of cliche. And if you notice that everyone starts to sound the same, and all the companies kind of say the same kind of narrative about how this is kind of ineluctable, the way, if we just like start to report on our ESG factors, the world's going to get better and we're all contributing to a better society. And that tends to turn people off. I think it's very interesting thinking about, the younger generations and people who are coming into the workplace now, and who are often very much the drivers of activism around expectations on these elements. They must feel kind of on the back foot and saying, well, what's this organization doing for me, when the organization is, sort of saying, I'm not really wanting to put my head above the parapet. And so I think the way companies can be much sort of clearer and specific and have their really sort of clear view about what the practical, pragmatic business results are created through a sustainable approach, rather than saying somehow, that'll give us access to capital sometime in the future, that's very difficult to measure. Well, I think it's real cool at the same time, companies are so sort of focused on sort of bean counting and all these indicators that they have to report on today, but they kind of need to have that vision of, it's not a vision, it's something really sort of concrete, sort of evidence of saying, what we do brings results because of A, B, C in these specific areas, in these specific topics, in these specific ways. So I think there's a kind of a new space to have to be, and I really like what you're saying about being courageous and being positive around that, because I think there's a lot of people, even the younger generations, who are saying, well, my voice was kind of being heard 5 years ago, but is it being heard? Who's listening today when they're seeing this? So I think there's sort of time for a bottom-up drive for this around it as well. I don't know what you feel, Ioannis, around the sort of that kind of positive engagement that we're not sort of hearing anymore.
I think it is. I agree with you, James. I would. Here's the way I think about this, right? You mentioned a more pragmatic and results-oriented approach, and I totally agree with that. But And we need to be careful in terms of what we mean by results and outcomes here, because I don't think the right approach would be going back to the exclusively business case, for instance, and insisting on financial agents, because what I think many people don't realize is that the outcome of any policy does not only depend on the policy itself, but in the institutional context in which it's embedded. So, for instance, if financial markets are disconnected from reality, not understanding planetary boundaries, for instance, not understanding social realities on the ground, and they reward exclusive focus on financial performance, and they define the value creation only in financial terms, even the best, most authentic, most impactful ESG or sustainability strategy is not going to pay off. And actually, if those genuine, impactful strategies do not pay off in the traditional sense, and my argument is that it's not the policy that has the problem, it's the system and the structure of the market that has the problem. And going back to what we were discussing earlier about courage, I think that's the kind of courage that we need in order to get create a narrative of value creation that is beyond the narrative of financial value creation. And let's not forget, I mean, of course, we are in a part of history where we take this definition of granted in terms of financial value. It has not always been the case. That's not how we define value, right? It's the financialization of everything that creates us to that value. But that's not what we define as value. If someone asks you if you're happy as a person, you're not only going to cite your salary and your tax benefits, right? There's many other dimensions, but we lost that continuity. And many people have talked about this, but the real courage, in my view, is going to come from redefining that narrative of value. Because, my humble opinion, that's where it all starts. If we're going to talk about changing individual behavior, the behavior of organizations, the behavior of governments and politics, and ultimately the behavior of institutions, all of those, in my view, are underpinned by what is it that we value as a society. And going back to what we were talking about earlier about the disorderly transition, if we have more wildfires, if we have more flooding, if we have more supply chain disruptions, if we have more the social fabric around the world being torn, quite literally, as is in the US, where you have two parallel universes in one country, that will force us to change our definition of value. So again, do we have the choice? Do we have the courage to preempt and put a more positive, more realistic narrative about what is value? Or are we going to expect a collapse to happen first and then redefine the value?
And Ioannis, this is a thing I wanted to touch base with you on, because we live in this world. We see the consequences, and you can't comprehend that people are sort of detached from it in their sort of a daily lives, and also in a business, because you're learning. I mean, you're teaching the executive. You have these executive sort of modules. I mean, how do these people who are well informed, well embedded in the infrastructure of how the system works, what's their reaction to this? It's like, is this sort of the way how they see it, it's going to happen but not going to hit me? Or, I mean, what's the sort of a logic around this?
I mean, logic is a very relative term in this context. Whereas, I think the idea is that, here's what I see it. I mentioned all of those levels earlier, and I think that at every single one of those levels, in other words, individual, corporate, political, institutional, we see change. And now we're kind of stuck basically in a system where we can only move as fast as the slowest will. And what and those wills have been traditionally being slow, but unfortunately what we look at now, especially in the US, is that the political will, not only is it not turning in the right direction, it's turning in the opposite direction, right? So when I speak to executives or even our MBA students, the idea is that they feel, and I understand that, they feel constrained within the current system. And I understand that. That's why we call it a system, right? Because no one person, one entity can control it. But there's also the flip side of this, right? In other words, it's not a God-given system.
No.
Right? It's a system that emerges out of all the choices that we make at all of these different levels. So what I'm trying to, the way that I try to frame this is that each one of us has agency in this system. Do we want to change the political aspect? Change the way you vote at the voting booth. Do you want to change your daily behavior? Vote with your money in terms of where you buy things and so on and so forth. And truth of the matter is that in this part of the world, sort of the rich part of the world, right, we have that luxury. We can
afford that. You're right. Yeah.
More than afford that. Right? So I think that's how we can talk about changing the system, again, in an orderly way, unless something forces us to change it, right? But that's the orderly way that I see. And by the way, that's why I think that education in general and business education more specifically has a huge role to play, right? And that's why I'm becoming less and less optimistic about the US, especially when I hear things like, for instance, the dismantling the Department of Education, imposing more extreme right-wing laws and regulations on public universities in the US, and so on and so forth. Those are all highly problematic, not only in the short term, but also in the long term.
James, any comments from your side on this one? I mean, there are so many interesting angles to this.
Yeah, no, also, I think the word, in terms of the concept of agents is really important, because so many people working on sustainability in companies now kind of are suffering. They're having positions on them, and they kind of responding to regulations, to rules above all in the EU. And I speak to sustainability heads and directors who say, kind of, I'm losing the joy of my job because I'm just like running from one thing to the next, trying to respond to external demands for data, for processes, for ticking the box, and it's becoming very much a kind of a bureaucratic job these days, certainly where we are now. And they're saying, and so it was interesting to change that dynamic. And I was interested in asking Ioannis, just as a final thing, what's if there was one thing that this year these people need to do, right? So I'm really pragmatic, is they're coming out of reporting season. The first CSRD reports are coming out, and everyone's going, my God, I've just been in this tunnel for 12 months or however long, and now I've got another tunnel starting because it's not right and we've got to do it. What's the one practical thing that they should actually have on their horizon this year? Say, no, despite all of everything that comes in my email and my inbox every day, I need to achieve. What would that one thing be?
I wish I had the answer to that, James. But
what would you recommend them to? What would your life? Just make sure this one thing you get it right.
I think rather than one thing, I would actually, if you allow me, rephrase that to one approach. Right, one approach that is actually, as you mentioned, beyond reporting and so on. In my view, this year and probably the years going forward, I think my highest priority would be pragmatism, right? Pragmatism and impact. So, and not only financial impact, but the impact of what I do. In other words, and I'm not just throwing these words out lightly, pragmatism in terms of future-proofing my business, even in a context in which the political environment is blind to these disruptions, for instance, right? Because ultimately politicians will change, but if I want to sustain a business always ought to be pragmatic, right? It doesn't matter if Trump is president, the supply chain disruptions due to climate change are still going to happen.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if he's president, if I create an entire toxic culture of the traditional old white male that has zero diversity, is racially profiling and so on and so forth, yet I'm not going to survive as a business, right? It is that obvious.
Look, we heard that from some businesses in January. I remember we talked about it, Sasha, like during Davos, some people stand up and say, I need to align my business to my customer base. And so if my customer base is diverse, and they were saying, despite, what you can call it in the categories or whatever, these are the demands that I need to have a successful business.
Yeah, exactly. So I think though we are going to see in terms of the approach is a pragmatic approach on the ground and inevitably managing upwards, right? Whether you're going to change the labels, whether you might exit some alliances while at the same time you're actually strengthening your risk framework, for instance, right? Whether you don't call it DEI and you now call it, I don't know, equal opportunity or whatever you want to call it. Labels matter, but only to an extent. And given the unfavorable political environment in the US, but don't forget though, right? I mean, that's the US we're talking about. There might also be a pragmatic approach may mean doubling down. For instance, look at, I was going to write something about this and I'm actually writing something about this today. Look at an article in Poets and Quants that was published yesterday. 7 or 8 European business school deans say, we're doubling down on DEI and ESG, right? I'm not sure if you've seen that. And that for me, as an academic based in Europe, I think that's remarkable. And, going back to the original question, what is courage? That is courage, right? Now, that is courage to have 7 or so business school deans that come out and say, you know what? We're not going to battle with reality. You battle the politics, but we keep the course because, if you want to have a future-proof business, how could you possibly ignore environmental and social realities?
And they're clear about it, and
exactly. So the advice would, of course, differ by region. And clearly in Europe, you have that institutional alignment. Hopefully, hopefully the EU is not going to backtrack on those commitments and the Green Deal, but at least. Still is endogenous. Companies in Europe speak with the European Commission. They speak with the European Parliament, right? They can convey those views. In fact, frame it as an opportunity, exactly like China is framing as an opportunity what is happening in the world.
Ioannis, many thanks. I mean, this could go on for a long time. I don't want to keep more of your time. Look, there are a couple of takeaways for me. It's what you said. It's basically the courage based on values in the different sort of parts, agencies of society, the way how we sort of operate that. Also the disorganized sort of a transition in a disoriented in many ways that was happening, but also the importance of education and of course the focus on where the companies and people working with this can actually make a difference and impact. Ioannis, many thanks for joining us on One Step Ahead Radio. All the best. I'm looking forward to follow you, and I hope that people will enjoy this conversation going forward. James, many thanks for being here with us today.
My part as well. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Half an hour, but so many topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's great. Take care.